Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I'm going live about now. Today is a very, very fully packed stream, which honestly is quite terrible for me because I'm feeling a little bit under the weather. I had a little bit of fever yesterday. Thankfully, didn't have quite a long work day today. So I thought of just going to the bed right after coming home, but here I am because we did discover basically some drama yesterday with my Twitter tech boys. Shout out to the usual like Gma James UK. Thank you all for sometimes finding me stuff I really like ranting about. I apologize for the noise. There is a terrible construction right across from me. I really hope my microphone does a decent job of isolating that. So while we will cover Tailosive Tech is basically did Apple become IBM video, we do have more stuff in general, like DM5 supposedly entering mass production on TSMC's N3P node. We have, of course, the stuff that I kind of missed, which, well, I mean, it came out yesterday, so it's not a big miss yet. That is Apple officially launching the Invites app. So it's not a feature that was baked and hidden in iOS 18.3, except for maybe the API stuff behind it. It is actually a standalone app. It does offer some capability to like accept invites on other platforms, but it is an iPhone thing right now. It doesn't have an iPad counterpart as an app, doesn't have a Mac counterpart. So I think those little few details I would like to cover just to let you know. I do believe this will be a nice feature for those very, very deep in the Apple ecosystem where all your friends and family members are like on Apple devices anyway. I do not think this is a professional tool in any way from its design, which we will also talk about because, yes, I've heard the reactions that it's very Vision OS like. But to the fact that it's really focused on like birthdays and parties. So this definitely is not like a full-on Outlook competitor on Apple's part. And we'll also keep on covering the competition. We have, of course, covered a lot about the Galaxy S25 Ultra in recent weeks. Now we will be covering the Xiaomi 15 Ultra, which of course is the more high-end version of what we currently have as the Xiaomi 15 Pro. And primarily it is a camera focused upgrade, so we'll be covering the camera specs here, and we will also be talking about why Samsung, the maker of actually one of those mentioned camera sensors that we'll talk about when we'll discuss the Xiaomi 15 Ultra, is actually not likely to implement their own sensor anytime soon. So a lot of variety, a lot of different topics. I already see Riveting Tail Chap being in the comments saying first and not just kidding. But hey, Mark, I hope you've been well and been feeling better overall. I've been sick since like Sunday. Like it only started like really on Monday. So I'm not really in the bettering yet phase, but it feels like it's just not a very bad cold. So I am pushing through it. Going to work, visiting family tomorrow, probably gonna wear a mask and shit like that. But for now, I do have the power to do this. I am drinking a lot of water. Had some warm soup before that, though thank you so much. I don't know why I was just lisping like crazy. So thank you so much for that, good sir. Welcome to the chat and the stream. Before we fully immerse ourselves in the drama, in all the controversy, which again is not a huge one, but it's just something I want to address. Of course, subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it out with anybody who think might enjoy it. Comment live. I love you guys' comments. I love hearing your opinions, your agreements, your disagreements, your suggestions for future topics. All stuff like that. You can make me read whatever you write within limits with a super chat or a super sticker. You can also become a direct supporter of the channel by becoming a channel member. Shout out to Angelica, Steve, and Max Maximus, or all Mark Tech Pro Max supporters right here on YouTube. And you can become a supporter over on Patreon. Link for all the social media stuff, Blue Sky, Twitter, the Patreon stuff. It's all linked in the description of this channel, so hopefully it doesn't become too big of a problem to find me somewhere other than YouTube. Yeah, but that's about it for all the intro stuff. Thank you so much for bearing through with it as per usual. You guys know I love ranting, rambling a little bit early on, but today we are actually continuing with ranting, however, much more targeted ranting, and this is me reacting to Tailosive Tech's video. I have no idea what it's called because YouTube does the stupid translation thing. Like my account settings are in English. It's still, because it knows that I'm in Germany, translates it to German, which is just absolutely infuriating. I'll just briefly look it up on my iPad where I always have the chat open. So Tailosive Tech is Apple has become IBM. Okay, so Jesus Christ, this is so stupid. YouTube like really needs competition, man, and it really needs like to put features like in front of you and explain them to you before it actually enacts them, right? Like it's not like I would have a big problem with YouTube translating some shit for me. Not that I need it, but like sure, there are plenty of languages I don't know. But my question is, why is it automatic, and why is it in the language of my region rather than in the language that I think I've specified like 3 times for my account settings? So yeah, that is a completely different and completely separate rant from all of this. And my God, the sound from the construction site nearby is just absolutely annoying. Please, microphone, please do a good job. I'll move it a little bit closer to my mouth, so maybe that will help it along. And without further ado, let's put it at full screen and let's get started.
What happens is, like with John Scully, John came from PepsiCo. They at most would change their product, once every 10 years. I mean, to them, a new product was like a new size.
I will let it have some impact on you before I pause too much, before I break the flow.
Bottle, right? So if you were a product person, you couldn't change the course of that company very much. So who influenced the success of PepsiCo? The sales and marketing people. Therefore, they were the ones that got promoted, and therefore they were the ones that ran the company. For PepsiCo, that might have been okay, but it turns out the same thing can happen in technology companies that get monopolies. If you were a product person at IBM or Xerox, so you make a better copy or a better computer. So what? When you have a monopoly market share, the company's not any more successful. So the people that can make the company more successful are sales and marketing people, and they end up running the companies. And the product people get driven out of decision-making forums. And the companies forget what it means to make great products. The product genius that brought them to that monopolistic position gets rotted out by people running these companies who have no conception of a good product versus a bad product. They have no conception of the craftsmanship that's required to take a good idea and turn it into a good product. And they really have no feeling in their hearts, usually, about wanting to really help the customers. And so they just grabbed defeat from the greatest victory in the computer industry. Xerox could have owned the entire computer industry today. Could have been, a company 10 times its size. Could have been IBM. Could have been the IBM in the 90s. Could have been the Microsoft in the 90s.
Okay, so obviously Steve Jobs was at some point kicked out of Apple. He wasn't the easiest person to interact with. Apple was not in a great position, but not terrible. I think Apple could have been fixed with Steve Jobs at that point. John Scully basically took over. This is the guy he mentioned. He came from Pepsi. He is basically your executive's executive, right? He is very, very much focused on like, how can we market shit? How can we like do like the smallest changes to affect really big sales, right? So he wasn't an idea guy. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't a designer. He wasn't even like a logistics guy like Tim Cook, right? He was primarily focused on what do we have, not how did we get there, right? How do we improve it so we actually have it in the future? but he was more of like, how do we package this? Now, this is at least Steve Jobs' version of it. I think history proves him mostly right, because obviously Apple under John Scully was pretty fucked. However, there is a point here to be made, which is that John Scully here is a very particular example. For one, he kicked out a very competent founder CEO. Now, Apple's board of directors did, but he took over for Steve, right? So, for one, there is a big contrast. Steve before, Steve after, in the middle, Scully, right? And second, he came in with very little connection, not just to the company, but to the tech industry as a whole. Now, back in the day, that was actually understandable, because in the 80s, a lot of people were freshly coming into the tech industry, whether it's actually engineers and designers, or even your executives, right? People were still learning about technology. Now, John Scully obviously did not learn too well, and he didn't really improve Apple's standing, to say the least, right? So Steve is rightfully saying that you need somebody in charge with the proper expertise, the proper vision. To be honest, Steve is not the highest like qualified person in that regard. He is an idea man, which is probably the best thing for a founder CEO, but he was never the best engineer at Apple. He was like in the beginning, Steve Wozniak was. Even when there were a 2-3-man team, Jobs was never the best engineer. Very quickly, Steve was never the best designer at Apple. I mean, famously Johnny Ive, but even under Johnny Ive, the amount of talent that was accumulated, yes, Steve ultimately made decisions, and even people like Phil Schiller, who are very much more executive style people rather than like your biggest experts in tech, they made decisions still on top of those designers. So it's not like you will always have the most qualified person in the room making the decision. It's just how hierarchies work. At some point, you have to delegate to the highest position in the company. And obviously, it's better to have a Steve Jobs there. If you are not quite an idea man like Steve Jobs, you probably need to divide like your power a little bit and give it a bit to other people. That's what Tim Cook did. In fact, there was a big problem early on when Scott Forstall, who felt himself more like Steve's successor, he was the lead guy on like macOS development, more iOS development. And he thought, oh, my vision of Apple's operating systems is so important. It's such a like basically the next step of everything that Steve did, that I either have to be the leader or I have to keep my current job with a lot more power, right? So I will not have Tim Cook dictating me like Steve did, right? And that's just a profound misunderstanding of how any company should work. Johnny Ive was a better designer than Steve, but he listened to Steve. Steve went away and he listened to Tim Cook. Johnny Ive over time left because he just wanted to do different shit. Like when you look at it, what he does right now, he doesn't do that much. He does like some almost like charity projects with some exclusive designs with like super rich people, right? He clearly got burned out on like the intense work of working for a company that designs phones, tablets, laptops, watches, TV accessories, earbuds, standalone monitors, speakers, different watch bands, different phone cases, all that stuff, right? Keyboards, trackpads, mouses, right? Obviously, over time, Johnny Ive got older, wasn't quite as interested in that. We don't have quite this singular personality to replace Johnny Ive, but I do believe that Apple's design team that was fostered under Johnny Ive is doing a pretty good job at these days. But the core problem here, of course, is that Steve is correct. The problem is, in this video that is called Apple Has Become IBM, is the concept that Apple right now is basically suffering either from what Apple suffered from under John Sculley, right, which is the example given by Steve, but it's also an example he gives for companies like Xerox and IBM. With IBM, I think people don't understand that IBM of today is still a good company that does like a lot of like cloud driven stuff and data management shit, and I believe their tools are used a lot in like sciencey shit. So yes, they are not Apple, they're not a $3.5 trillion company, yes, they're not a constant innovator, but IBM is not bankrupt. IBM is not gone from history. So the idea is, when you're saying Apple has become IBM, I don't think people like Drew from Tailosive Tech are saying, oh, Apple is so far gone, it's completely impossible to get excited about anything about them, but they are not what they were once, right? So, however, obviously Steve described a very particular thing that was happening, well, partially with Apple and John Sculley, but also companies like IBM and Xerox that had very strong positions in the market because they were first comers to the market, right? Specifically IBM. Now, the point here is that Apple has reached such highs. Steve described them as monopolistic for IBM and Xerox because those were like 80+% monopolies in their respective businesses. We'll get to how that does not apply to Apple, especially after seeing some of their recent market shares, especially in the smartphone business. But also the problem was that over time, the people in charge of those companies, they went away from the geniuses, founder CEOs, even though there's a lot of criticism to be had with glorifying that kind of leadership too. I think Steve himself actually understood that. This is why he created things inside Apple to actually replace that like cult of personality that existed around him. Like, I'm sure he liked it for himself, but he understood that it wasn't sustainable for Apple in the long term. It wasn't something that he wished every company would just replicate. But obviously it's better to have a genius founder CEO than an executive with zero love for what you're building, right? That's the basic like contradiction here of like ideas, or the dichotomy of what can happen. And Drew will basically put Apple at the level of those companies who at some point lost their good executives, lost their good CEOs, and put marketing people in charge. Now, there is a very interesting editing trick here. He put, of course, the video of the new Apple campus. It's not that new anymore, right? But that spaceship design. And when Steve was talking about marketing people, like, I think it's on purpose, but the video kept showing Tim Cook as he basically, this is from where he starts a lot of his keynotes, right? Listen to this.
And the product people get driven out of decision-making forums. And the companies forget what it means to make great products. Running the companies. And to make the company more successful are sales and marketing people. And they end up running the companies. And the product people get driven out of decision-making forums.
So this basically paints Tim Cook, right? Which is fascinating because Tim Cook has now been Apple's CEO for 13 years, right? I don't know what happened that Drew's own, like that I believe is longer than Drew's coverage on YouTube, right? Or about as long. I'm actually not sure. I know he's been doing videos from a very young age, but I'm not sure if he was that young. Like he started in the iPhone 4S era. I would doubt that. But my point about this is that Tim Cook is not a marketing person. Tim Cook is a logistics guy. He's a finance guy. Sure, you could argue, oh, finances are also not the product. But he was chosen by Steve Jobs. He was the guy for Steve, for whom Steve believed that he had the capacity to run the company himself and the humility to give others enough power so that where he might fall short as a not quite an idea man like Steve, or not quite an engineer like maybe like a Wozniak type, that he would have the capabilities to run the company as a CEO, right? And it's funny to me that after 13 years, after covering the company in such glowing ways before that, it's suddenly now that Drew alludes to the idea that maybe Tim Cook is not quite Steve, which we know he isn't, but that doesn't make him a bad executive. Tipomaster joining the chat. These are harder to get to now that I'm back in an office, but I'm alive. If you ever said they're wondering, yeah, man, I missed you, Tipomaster. Thank you so much for coming back. I guess your work from home stuff was annulled. Wait, are you working for? Oh my God, I forgot which company recently forced everyone back. You can let me know if you want to, but. Yeah, I've heard that a couple of companies basically for 2025 just said, oh, everyone's going back to the office, F you. And I agree. IBM is still a successful company, and Drew, I think, knows the distinction well too. I have felt it's lacking the sex, as Steve would put it. Yeah, I actually, like, if that was the main problem, in that way, I would probably put Apple, like, if that's your belief, I don't think so. But if you believe that Apple just lacks the sex appeal, let's go away from the pure word sex, right? I guess you could say Apple is a little bit more like Microsoft, right? Which Steve said at some point had no taste, right? But IBM obviously is just so much infinitely smaller than Apple. It's just very hard to make that comparison without making it seem like Apple completely lost its way. Yes, they could have said Apple is the new Motorola, right? Irrelevant, bought off by a Chinese company, like completely changed its brand, whatever, right? The IBM example follows from an example that Steve gave about IBM back in the day. It's not actually applicable to IBM today, which, yeah, is not the greatest of tech companies, but it does pretty well for itself, and it's not like marketing driven. It knows what its enterprise consumer needs and does that. So it's a slightly misguided comparison where it's using something Steve said, but it's something Steve said like in the 90s after, or early 2000s. I think it's in the 90s after his return to the company. This is why he's talking about people like John Scully. And to me, it's just funny to like where obviously Tim is not a John Scully like person. None of the people currently in charge, not your Craig Federighi's, who, by the way, is actually more responsible for pushing AI inside Apple than even most investors. Tim Cook is actually incredibly reserved when it comes to over-investing in AI. We'll get later to why AI is such an important example here. Then John Turnus was elevated inside the company step by step. He is an engineer. He's been at Apple for decades despite being young. So basically all his life has been shaped by Apple, all his professional life. He has pushed for everything from larger batteries, more ports, better cooling, right? So all the things that might not be sexy in terms of marketing, but ultimately made Apple's Pro devices, made Apple's Macs better. And I just struggle to think what marketing people are so in charge of Apple right now, doing things that Steve Jobs was doing back in the day as well. So I'll just let Drew continue. I'll let him make his points. Hey, if Drew ever wants to like have a discussion, he can invite me to one of his live streams or something like that. He can join one of mine. There will be a lot more people watching if it's one of his live streams, and we can actually discuss his points point by point. But I do not actually think he makes even enough points. This is why I've been like babbling 20 minutes about what Steve said, because I do believe that Steve put it so well. that if you understand Steve, if you understand the basic history of Apple, which I do, I've been covering Apple in a way since I was 14. My essay in my last grade for German, like the language, right, was a big presentation about Apple's history. Right, it was between technology and cult, an analysis of Apple's like psychological impact on its consumers, on how its history pushed it to that. Like this is why I always get very, very like defensive about this shit. It's not because I'm defensive particularly about Apple. It's because I know a lot about this, and I always get pissed when people clearly misrepresent quotes, clearly, like very selectively take out anecdotes from Apple's history and stuff like that. Yeah, so just so you know, this is not designed to be a big defense of Apple. It's a deconstruction of what Drew will be saying.
In the computer industry. Company.
What separates Apple from those earlier monopolies?
Well, for one, and I will be going through it step by step, so please feel free to comment. Let me know where you think I might be presenting false data or just a wrong interpretation. First of all, Apple is not a functional monopoly in any way. Apple might hold like 40% market share in the US. Sure, that could constitute like a monopoly in some ways. But Apple's worldwide market share of smartphones is 18%. Apple is currently experiencing a lot of competition from the Chinese market with a lot of cheaper brands. Apple has to work with other companies who are asking them to either produce in the country or just make like concessions to the country, like invest into it in terms of education and jobs. So whether that's India and forcing Apple to produce a lot more inside there, or Indonesia outright banning Apple from operating until they invested a lot in this in the country. So Apple has no monopoly. Countries can say no to them. China, right yesterday, after all the stupid tariff shit, just announced that that they would have an antitrust thing going against Apple and Google. The European Union has been investigating against Apple and has forced them to change certain things. So Apple, yes, has a lot of power, but they also get constantly their power checked. It's unironically the OS that does that the least, but I guess that's kind of like basically home field advantage in that regard. So Apple, for one, is not a monopoly in terms of market share. It's not even a monopoly in terms of mind share, right? Because yes, a lot of Chinese companies might treat Apple like that, with HyperOS and ColorOS basically often being one-to-one copies of iOS. But that's just from Apple's position, right, of often being first, of often just like shaping user opinions. But that's not coming from a position because, oh, the only phone you ever see inside the store is an iPhone, right? Apple does not have the position that IBM had like in the late 70s with computers, or the 70s, obviously after a point, Apple was the alternative, right? They never had the position that Xerox had, like with printers, or like, so Apple is different from those monopolies with one point, and that is that it's not a monopoly. Like not even close. So this is one thing that I've argued time and time again with all the regulatory laws against Apple, where I am fine with you regulating Apple, but please don't do that pretending like Apple is like a 60-70% monopoly, even in the way that like the Google search engine is, or the YouTube store, the YouTube website is, or app, however you want to see it, right? Like this idea that Apple has a similar position that they can abuse, and they can only grow through marketing at this point, in the way that Steve described it for IBM and Xerox, is absolutely not true. Let's continue.
Colorful marketing images?
Colorful marketing images are not a monopoly sign. For one, every company does marketing, big and small. I even occasionally take out like 1 out of 10 YouTube videos and like put out some ad algorithm for like 10, $15 on YouTube to maybe reach a country where I know I have never had viewers, right? I'm like, 90% of the time it doesn't work, but hey, back in the day it helped me like grow through Indonesia, and then after a time I had some more genuine success in, for example, with the Indian market, so I'll put out ads there. That didn't help too much, but then one day it helped a lot. So marketing is something all people do if they for their business. You can argue how much marketing you have to do. If you actually look at Apple's marketing budgets in percentage to their overall revenue, they're pretty small. In fact, Apple's spending overall is pretty small. They keep growing their research and development costs and things like that, but they do not actually like at any point say like, oh, you know what, we need marketing, or we need this crazy one new feature because it's just hype on TikTok, let's invest $50 billion into it, the way that Google and Microsoft are burning money for AI just to appease shareholders, even if like Microsoft cannot even bake their AI too much in their own freaking operating system at this point. Like they try shit with Copilot and things like that, but just like consumers keep rejecting it, one feature after the other. So again, Apple is not a monopoly. Colorful marketing is not the sign of a monopoly. Let's continue.
Playful graphic design for the event intros?
Okay, it's gotten a little more playful. That's primarily a result of I would argue technical capabilities just kept improving. When you look at YouTube in general and the new generation, people look at that more than they did before, right? Like even when you look at MKBHD's tech review videos, you'll find that they're very elaborately produced, more like artistically edited. So this change in Apple just reflects a broader change in society. YouTube channels with like 200 subscribers sometimes will do like very fancy editing and invest a ton in like expensive equipment. This idea that again, any of that colorful, flashy stuff is the sign of a failing company that cannot grow without it is bullshit. Marketing has always happened. I mean, like, think different. It's a marketing slogan. It doesn't even mean that much, right? I would argue if think different came out today as a marketing slogan from Apple, people would just be saying, think for what? There's tech everywhere. And I mean, people were saying that back in the day with the iPod too. They were like, you have like think different ads for people with like headphones in their ears while they're dancing around. Like, it's basically a silly slogan that appeals to the youth to say, oh, you're a new generation, have fun, be colorful, enjoy your music, right? The Mac versus PC ads, they focused on the fact that there were fun creation tools like GarageBand, iMovie on Mac OS, while Windows was more of like the Office operating system, right? More focused on Word, PowerPoint, Excel, right? If those same ads were coming out today, people would be saying, "Oh, that's such a cheap shot." Of course, people still need Excel sheets and whatever, right? People would be overanalyzing every single of those old things, every single failure Apple had back in the day, because just the market for Apple criticism is much larger. Apple has a larger install base. The tech community broadly is larger, right? The nerd culture is more popular than it ever was in many ways. And just sites like YouTube, Twitter, they make it easy to talk about things. And of course, those people who already love tech and want to discuss tech might also be the people most likely to be on those platforms. this idea that Apple was so fundamentally different, not focused as much on marketing, fancy slogans, colors, and animations. This is like a retrospective analysis issue where you only take the things that you liked that happened in the past, and you're like, look how much positive was in the past. For today's point in time, you then take basically everything negative, and you're like, you see how Apple has changed, right? That's a very, very bad bias in analysis. No, it's not even a bias against Apple necessarily. It's just the wrong methodology, I guess.
A creative headquarters, retail presence with
I mean, retail presence. Let's ignore the headquarters. The headquarters are a building, so it has nothing even to do with like real consumer outreach. I think Apple spoke about it like twice during their keynotes. Marketing presence, definitely something Steve loved, and it's something that is actually the sign of a company still trying to convince consumers. If you are a monopoly, you arguably would not waste your money on extra fluff inside your stores, because you would be saying the people are already here, they don't really have an alternative. Why do I need to spend more money on fancy trees, on training the employees in the store, on hiring more people so that actually the entire process is faster? I don't give a fuck about customer satisfaction. Those bastards will buy my product anyway, right? That's how monopolies think. It's not let's like sure, monopolies will still try to make it nice enough for you so they don't eventually lose that standing completely. But the things that Apple is investing in right now are the things that Apple has always invested in. Johnny Ive was not just a product designer, he also designed Apple's markets, like Apple stores. Like the consumer outreach of having a pretty store with nicely presented products with people who can explain to you how they work. I just was to the Apple store like 2 weeks ago, and I saw like 8 elderly people sitting around the table getting explained to them how the mail app works. That's important. That's not something you would really do as a monopoly who already has those people in the bank.
lots of trees and glass. All of the differences we find between the monopolies of the computer revolution and Apple today mostly stem down to how they're marketed.
No, I mean, they're objectively not. The problem with IBM and Xerox back in that day was that they actually stopped changing the markets they were like that they were so revolutionary in, right? When you look at like Xerox, know less about. Let's focus a little bit more about IBM, right? IBM, of course, famously lost like the user interface wars with Apple, right? Because Apple basically found a small company that created a lot of what we now know as like the modern mouse interface, basically click and drag and drop, whatever. And IBM lost out on that. Obviously, over time, everyone kind of matched, but by that point, Microsoft and Windows became the major player rather than IBM. IBM, again, focused more on the serious stuff of computing, went into data centers and cloud eventually, only to then be overtaken in all of that by Microsoft again. So that's a little bit funny with Azure. But that's neither here nor there, right? The entire point was Apple has not yet lost in any of the markets they entered, right? Like the processes that Steve discussed with like, oh, a marketing guy takes over, he has no understanding of the products he builds, or she, but let's be honest, we're talking about the 80s. If you were major executives, it's unfortunately very likely you were a guy. And the problem is that Apple still has some of the highest customer satisfaction rankings in all of consumer tech. I'm talking 94% plus for iPad, Mac. We have people who buy still iPads and Apple Watches that are over 50% new to the market. So Apple by no means only grows by like by like reaching out to people with marketing. There are plenty of switchers who objectively then say, oh, I have this better user experience there, it solves my issue here and there. That does not mean Apple will be perfect. No company will be perfect. Especially the larger company gets, the more room there is for mistakes. I mean, even back in the Steve Jobs days, there were keynotes where like iOS 4.1 or iPhone, no, iOS 4.1 was iOS. iPhone OS was 1 until 3. But iOS 4.3, I believe, had like a slide where the biggest point that Steve Jobs was mentioning was bug fixes, right? So Steve with his ego, he didn't like mentioning bug fixes on the stage, right? This is the guy who said you were holding it wrong when the iPhone had antenna gate problems. So this idea that Apple now is in a state of disarray that would have never happened under Steve, and that's the guy we are referring to, right? That's the guy we spent 2 of the first minutes of the video with. That is just simply not true. I mean, the iPhone 4S, Apple like messed up to make it white. The iPhone 4, Apple messed up to make it white. And during the iPhone 4S presentation, Steve Jobs was joking that the iPhone 4S is available day one as white, right? So this idea that Apple is now in a calamity similar to how IBM lost the user interface wars, that's just bullshit. Apple has always had problems, just as every other company. They used to do a lot less. There was one iPhone model and then one iPad model. And that was right the year when Steve Jobs died, 2011, right? The iPad 2 was a big change over the iPad 1, but it was still only one iPad to make in the year. And then the iPhone 4S came out after his death. That's why many people called it back in the day the iPhone 4 Steve, right? The S in the hearts of a lot of us fanboys stood for Steve. And then over time, Apple had to make bigger smartphones to compete in the landscape. Apple had to offer different price points because the overall market had grown. It was important to still address those. The same thing happened with iPad, different price options, different size options. They had a ton of transitions back in the Steve Jobs days. They transitioned from PowerPC on Mac to Intel. Then under Tim Cook, they transitioned from Intel to Apple Silicon. I will mention again why I'm mentioning those, because they are a counter to something that Drew will be saying later on. But Apple always had issues. Apple always had changes. Apple always had transitionary phases. In fact, it says, I think, a lot about Drew at this point. And the more Apple fanboy mindset, or Apple sheep, as he has called himself, that he used to have, we're seeing more mistakes at Apple right now, not more than before, but just more realizing them yourself, makes you shocked that like, oh, how was Apple not like that in the past? What has changed? No, Apple has always had certain issues, and it's fine. No human is perfect, no company is perfect, no product is perfect. And that's not a deflection, that's not an excuse. I have criticized Apple for a lot of things, from their pricing on storage and RAM, which I actually do believe reflect a little bit of monopolistic mindset. Not because the iPhone has a monopoly, but because if you want an iPhone, Apple knows that you will probably not change your mind based on $100 price differences in storage versus what the competition offers, right? So that's where better competition that might actually not just get you to change, like if it was like half the price, but competition that was so good that it could make you change if it was just 10% cheaper, that's where we'd all benefit as consumers. I could argue that this is criticism more towards other companies than it is even towards Apple, because the customer satisfaction for Apple is still higher than those companies. And that's after Apple has like increased prices on a lot of stuff, still keeps the iPad limited, contrary to what a lot of people want. Again, let's continue.
They all come down to how great Apple is at animating their next-gen product. That's why so many people people struggle to find functionality and utility within the latest hype train at Apple, their intelligence features. No, the
Apple Intelligence. And I've been talking about this nonstop basically because we always get new shit about Apple Intelligence. Apple Intelligence was announced in last June during WWDC. So the earliest it could have come out was September, right? Because that's when the new version of iOS launches. It happened to launch a month later, first in a pretty limited state, then got a few more features. Most importantly, it also got a little bit more international support. It's still only English based, but hey, going outside of the United States and reaching market like Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, those are good steps. And iOS 18.4 is the true big start of Apple Intelligence, which will be happening in April. It will launch out to billions of more people by supporting Indian and I believe English in India too. Or I'm not actually sure if English in India is already supported, but like simplified Chinese that opens up the market to 1.5 billion people. German, French, Italian, so many languages. And it's finally bringing a new version of Siri, which right now Siri has gotten better in some ways. Primarily, it got the new pretty animation. This is what Drew will mention. But Apple has always been about pretty animations. Go back to the original iPhone 4S, go back to the original Siri announcement. There were pretty animations inside that new app, right? That's how it happens. Sometimes the design might predate, like if Apple Intelligence was pushed, they don't need to push the design for Siri. Like, in fact, people were complaining when iOS 18 launched, right? And it didn't have like the new Siri features. It didn't have the new Siri design. And people were saying like, oh, Apple, why couldn't you give us at least the animation? What's so different? Like people have this complete dichotomy. They completely forget what they were saying 5 minutes ago. It's just as all those people who are always saying like, Apple, we need more iOS 12 or macOS OS 10 Snow Leopard like releases. Give us no new features, even though both of those releases had new features, but just focus on system refinement, performance, battery life, right? And then the same people, 5 minutes later, you show them the leak from Front Page Tech saying that the camera app will be looking different. They're like, Apple, you need to make iOS 19 look like Vision OS. That's like your biggest priority. Give us finally a redesign. I'm like, bro, you were complaining like 5 minutes ago about how Apple is not longer refining its shit. Now you want them to do a complete redesign on top of Apple Intelligence, on top of recently launching Vision OS. On top of all their like new initiatives like improving gaming from iPhone to iPad to Mac, right? Like having all of the ecosystem still run cohesively together. Like you really want a complete redesign, but you also want the system more refined than ever. That's just not how it works. That's not how software development works. That's just like... And I'm just getting a little pissed because I feel like Apple has things that deserve criticism. For example, one thing that iOS, iPadOS, macOS all lack is a good volume mixer, right? Like what Windows has in the right lower corner. That shit should be and what many Android devices have, right? But to be honest, if you go into settings, each and every one has it. But like, for example, Samsung has been implementing that for years and years in a pretty good way. And to me, it's just like, those are objective criticism that I think every Apple consumer could stand behind, send Apple feedback, be even like a graphic designer and send Apple like an example of how you think it should look. And then Apple would actually feel the combined power of the Apple ecosystem or the Apple platform of us as consumers and actually bend to us, right? Instead, we have these schizophrenic, completely disjointed attempts at asking for full redesigns Or no, just a year of full refinement, no features needed. And then we have like, oh, Apple Intelligence, we don't need it. Launch it only when it's ready. But at the same time, oh, Apple, you're lacking so far behind in AI features. What are you doing? And that's just us consumers. Apple still has to listen to shareholders, at least to a degree, right? Like Apple cannot just completely disconnect themselves from it, or there will be unrest at the company, as people will like have trouble with like the board of directors. People might be let go and shit like that. That's just not something you want. And it's just so confusing to me, because do you really not understand how any of this works?
Primary reason so many of us wanted Apple Intelligence on our devices was for the animation.
No, I couldn't give a flying fart about the Siri animation. I still don't have it on my iPhone and iPad. I have it on my Mac because it's not a gatekeeper platform in the European Union, so it actually got Apple Intelligence in English. But I don't have it for Siri on iPhone and iPad, and I still use Siri just as often as I always have to set reminders, calendar events, alarms, timers, right? Super small stuff. All the stuff that goes even back to Siri from 12, 13 years ago. And the stuff that, by the way, Apple is still best at, because all of those basic tasks can run on device. That's what a lot of people missed. A few years ago, Apple integrated not just the voice recognition of Siri to run on device on the neural engines of their newer chips, but they even backed some understanding for the basic stuff. And that was during a time when Google launched Google Gemini, right? And people were like using this super advanced transformer-based large language model, and they were asking it to set like a timer or an alarm, and it couldn't do that because Google hadn't baked all the features of Google Assistant into Google Gemini, right? So again, I'm not saying that because other companies fuck up, Apple has is allowed to also fuck up. But I am saying it's just stuff that happens. It's if you don't understand that it's human nature and that problems like that will arise, I'm sorry, but you will not be happy covering any company in tech or any issue in tech. I myself am not Apple exclusive. This channel is called Mark Tech. It's not iMark, as it used to be in the very beginning. It's not Mark's Apple Tech or something like that. I do primarily cover Apple because that's where I get my fun from, but I will cover the relevant competition or even some stuff that's almost completely unrelated, like PC stuff. And I even used to do like the occasional Tesla video because while I don't like Tesla is very important in EVs, and I'm very excited about EVs as a category. So I would like to have like a foot in the door of covering EVs, but I gave that up. It would have required way too much Tesla coverage, and I cannot stand that.
Not for the features themselves, was so that we could see the screen dance with its pixels and dazzling colors. These are not the idea of the software engineers.
By the way, yeah, Apple's software engineers do work with their designers. Their designers like flashy stuff. That's what has always happened. I mean, Johnny Ive notoriously prioritized thinness. No marketing department was telling Johnny Ive no. Steve could have told or telling him to do that in the first place. He did it because he loved pushing technology to the edge. He loved challenging himself with taking, oh my God, we have this new, more efficient component like this Core 2 Duet processor. How thin can we make a MacBook Air, right? Then like even their internal teams, like their chip, not their chip designers, but basically like the people responsible for integrating Intel chips onto like an Apple motherboard, right? Instead of taking like a hard drive almost enclosure, right, which was the standard even for SSDs back in the day, and just connecting it over SATA on the motherboard. Those designers, those engineers worked together. They just took the flash modules and put them directly on the motherboard. It was thinner, it was more space efficient, it was more efficient overall because the storage could actually be closer to the processor, right? And yeah, it was also nice because it basically made it impossible to upgrade the storage yourself, which obviously benefited Apple's margins. So all those things work together, and marketing always had some influence. But if you believe that the influence of Apple's marketing team is now somehow immeasurably higher than it was back in the day, you're greatly mistaken. I'm very sorry. You have a very, very ahistorical view of Apple. You have a very ahistorical view of Steve, the people who worked for Steve, who made a name for themselves at Apple. I'm sorry.
This is marketing. This is salespeople that know how to sell us sugared water year after year after year. While Apple isn't necessarily in the beverage game, they're definitely in the same predicament we've seen previous monopolies fall into.
Apple has not had yet a major revenue drop. In fact, their last quarter was their most successful quarter ever. $124 billion of revenue, $36 billion of profit, many tens of billions of dollars of free cash flow. Still all the money they need for research and development, for stock buybacks, for dividend payment to shareholders, for marketing, all that stuff that is needed because, for one, you're a company that wants to invest in its own future. That's research and development. You're a company that needs to invest in its own shareholders because you are right now the highest valued stock in the world at a combined value of $3.5 trillion. You will be literally kicked out as CEO or CFO if you refuse to do that shit. And you invest in your consumers in that way. Like, consumers still know about your latest product coming out. Consumers know about the latest features. And yes, sometimes you will make mistake. You might over advertise a specific feature, or you might start advertising a feature, but then that feature gets delayed, like we saw with Apple Intelligence, right? So you end up with only having the animation, but not the actual functionality. That has been remedied. It was only 1 month. The same has happened before. Do you remember Deep Fusion back in the day? I believe launching together with the iPhone 11 series. That took a while to come out afterwards. Do you remember Portrait Mode on the iPhone 7 Plus? That came out later. Do you remember Siri itself launching in beta for years and years? It's like, I feel like people just cover Apple for a decade and then like don't remember shit.
How do we make these products interesting? How do we convince people to go out and keep buying them?
Yeah, that's part. If you have a good product or not, you still have to make sure people actually know about this product. Because not everyone is a tech enthusiast. In fact, most everyone is not. So you still have to reach those people. You have to package those techy features in a way that is more accessible to the regular consumer. This has always been the case. Like, from the Think Different, from the Mac versus PC ads, to the I always forget, like, to all the like colorful iPod stuff, right, with the silhouettes and shit like that. Just focused on the music, right? The 1,000 songs in your pocket shit and things like that, right? Like, like Apple didn't talk about, oh, we have bought the smallest hard drive that Sony could buy. In fact, it's so innovative and it's more efficient than anything else in the industry right now. It runs basically silently, and look, we have integrated a touch wheel, a scroll wheel. It's a very nice, intuitive user interface for you. No, the focus was on the songs that the iPod delivered, right? And it was with exactly what he's saying, flashy marketing. Like, let me find it just like quickly, right? iPod ad, colorful poster. Yeah, like all that stuff with the silhouettes, right? I mean, that's literally the definition of flashy and colorful. He will later talk about like iPhone colors, right? Being designed to attract your eye inside the App Store, even if you don't buy all those colors. You remember the iPod Nano colors? And do you remember all the iPod Nano redesigns that basically were even more fickle, basically, than every Android company later on, basically getting a new design every year just so they could, like, it wasn't the best selling iPod. The iPod Touch was the main driver at that point. The iPhone, of course, became super important. And the iPod Classic was your workhorse iPad. But the iPod Nano or iPad Mini, I always forget. Like, I know it's the iPod Nano in the end, but I always forget if like in the beginning it was called iPod Mini, but like here, Apple even made something like this by the end, right? Which is like the most cutish miniaturized iPad almost. And then of course the iPod Touch was always just a dumbed down iPhone in a way. So, and yes, it was very colorful because color also sells. Yes, these are influences that were always there at Apple. Whether we're talking 1 decade ago when Tim Cook was really like finally taking over the full reins after Steve's death, like 3-4 years into it, or if we're talking 2 decades ago when Steve was a god inside Apple. That was always the case. Ah, God, why does nobody remember shit?
And there's next to no difference anymore with the product. While Pepsi.
This is if you focus on annual upgrades. Yes, technology matures. The improvements slow down. That is true if you look at every single business inside technology. Game consoles have stagnated relatively, right, with how much more power you can add in 7 years, how many new features you can add once you've already gone through all the gimmicks, right? Even Nintendo now with the Nintendo Switch 2 will have probably their smallest ever generational leap, but it will probably be one of the most well received because it's actually listening to what consumers want, which is a Switch 2, a second better version of the Switch. And cameras, for example, right? There is only so much you can do if you are already at a full frame sensor, a decent enough image signal processor or a processor in general, and all the optical developments of like the last couple of centuries, right? If you're Sony or Canon or Nikon or Fuji, right? There is a limit to how much you can improve a camera every year. But, and I'll get it out because I'll hit you over the head with it time and time again. As Rene Ritchie always says, you always, he only recently returned, and thank God for that. But buying tech often has to be treated like buying bread. You personally might not be going to the bakery every day, right? But whenever you do go to the bakery, you want a fresh piece of bread, right? The same thing with the iPhone or iPad. You might not buy it necessarily every year, but if you go in and buy it every 3 or 4 years, you expect the product to be at most like 6-8 months old. Probably you would want to buy it as fresh as possible, so the longevity of ownership is as prolonged as possible, right? And yes, sure, if you laser focus on how small the improvements from the iPhone 15 Pro Max to the 16 Pro Max are, yeah, I mean, Wi-Fi 7, but it's not even faster Wi-Fi 7. Like some improvements to 5G and shit like that, but barely noticeable. It's not even a full modem change. The camera changes come primarily from the image signal processor. The battery life slight battery capacity increase, more efficient chip, chip in general faster in CPU, GPU, AI tasks, right? Camera control might not be the perfect button for you the way it's placed, but hey, it's at least one extra free click, right? You don't have to connect that camera functionality to the action button, nor do you have to give up double click functionality on the power button the way you do it, for example, on Samsung products, right? Like all those small changes, they kind of line up, and it's a better product. Slimmer bezels still, slightly larger screens, and then you compare it over 2 years ago, right? And suddenly the bezels are even slimmer. There are way more camera changes now, with a different new HDR pipeline, right? There is the presence of the brand new 5x telephoto, not just on the small model, which was added on the 16 Pro, but for the first time ever on the 15 Pro Max for Apple, right? Always on display on iPhone 14 Pro versus previously not existing on 13 Pro, a ProMotion on 13 Pro versus previously not existing on 12 Pro, 5G on the 12 series versus not existing on the 11 series, 3 camera setups on the 11 series versus maximum dual camera setups on the 10s series, the presence of a cheaper redesigned 10R model versus keeping on the iPhone 10s, 10R generation versus the presence of just like slightly rehashed older designs with iPhone 8 and 8 Plus next to the much more revolutionary iPhone 10. And before that, all those little changes over time that also were relatively big in the day, right? Bigger batteries, big screens, faster Touch ID, or with the iPhone 5s, Touch ID at all, right? Of course, the pace of development changes, but we still get new features every year. And if you are a regular consumer and you update every 2, 3, 4, or even 5 years, right? Imagine if it's your year to upgrade this year, right? So you will be upgrading to the iPhone 17 Pro later this year. And let's say you actually stuck with a 5-year cycle. That means you will be upgrading. Let's say you really had a high-end device back in the day, the iPhone 12 Pro Max, right? You didn't even have like an iPhone 12 Pro because that one had like a smaller main camera sensor and whatever, right? So the improvements you get, for one, you go from a 5G that was pretty underbuilt to a 5G that's actually usable with a lot longer battery life. You get a brighter screen with slimmer bezels, the dynamic island instead of the notch, with 120 hertz ProMotion, way superior HDR capabilities, 10-bit rather than 8-bit. You get better pulse width modulation ranges. You get all the extra buttons that have accumulated, action button versus camera control. You get double the memory with the 12 Pro Max maxing out at 6 gigs of RAM, the 17 Pro series maxing out at 12 gigs of RAM. You get like an order of a magnitude more performance for shit like AI, and then still very decent over 2x improvements across CPU and GPU. You get new capabilities for gaming, for stuff like mesh shading and hardware accelerated ray tracing and AI-based upscaling with Metal FX. You get significantly better camera in every way in terms of hardware. Stuff that gets improved even over the iPhone 16 Pro Max, like the new selfie camera and new 48 megapixel telephoto, but then just like everything way better over the iPhone 12 Pro back in the day. And you get all of that in a product that is similarly heavy, despite the larger screen, because it's now titanium instead of stainless steel. It charges faster. The ecosystem of like Qi 2 charging is way bigger now. You have a lot of accessories to choose from. Your phone doesn't get as hot while wirelessly charging, so it might actually be usable in scenarios where it previously wasn't. You go from Lightning to USB-C with 10 gigabits per second or more. Face ID at that point only worked in portrait mode, now works in landscape, works way faster. And on and on and on. And to me, this is why if you focus on 1 year to 1 year upgrades, you will be disappointed with tech. But this is why Apple never has like one product for you. They have the iPhone for you, they have the Apple Watch for you, the iPad for you, the Mac for you, all in different price ranges, all in different size categories. Some focus more on performance, some battery life, some focus just on the absolute max you can deliver with something like the Mac Pro. Like, Jesus, it's, of course you will be bored if you just look at like the minuscule smallest upgrades of just the iPhone from year to year, and you even refuse to keep like reviewing new iPads or new Apple Watches and new Macs for that reason, right? Like, I know like you have to pay for that stuff, but I mean, that's kind of the reviewer business. If you don't get like a review unit from Apple, you have to pay for it. You have to return it on time if you don't want to end up stuck with the purchase. And then you would enjoy it all that much more, in my opinion.
Was dependent on the sweetness of sugar and fructose corn syrup. Apple is dependent on colorful, bedazzling marketing. That's why you'll see the media and content creators lean in to unboxing every new iPhone color they can possibly get.
I mean, the problem is I don't even know anybody who watches that. All my friends are like techies, and they understand that those color shits are for regular consumers who might actually look into the color they want to own, and they would like to see those colors before they go to the store. To them, it's not about, oh, I need that color. To them, it's more about like, oh, it's time for me to upgrade. My old phone is not as fast anymore. It doesn't have the greatest battery life. I know the cameras are way better on the new generation, right? Oh, and there are some pretty new colors. How do they look? How do they compare to each other? That's what Apple is doing. It's not like a trick. It's...
Apple knows in the end that the vast majority of people are buying the same basic colors, black, white, space gray.
That depends actually on the year. Like, yeah, the vast majority will buy black or white because those are neutral. But even if you have like 30% of your market buying blue, green, yellow, don't forget that 30% of 220 million annual iPhone sales are over 60 million. Right? This idea that you can downplay those sales because they are not 50% or even 60 or sometimes even 70% of all your sales, 30% of this huge market would put you instantly into the Fortune 500, probably over the 100 slot or even more.
The reason they keep offering those different color options year after year is not because they necessarily sell all that well. Most people cover them up with a case, but it all comes down to the marketing.
I mean, people cover them up with a case. That's also not quite true. People have transparent cases nowadays. They have cases that match the color of the color they have underneath. The large camera bump is free, which means, and the color match camera control and often some of the buttons are free too. So yes, they cover it up, but they might cover it up with something transparent, that's something that still shows significant part of the chassis, or something that really matches the color. So no, again, you're presenting it as if people are stupid and they end up buying a color that they never see. They might wear a case outdoors, but then take it off once they get home. That's what I do most of the time. Like, I just get annoyed when people are like seen as like these complete morons. And people are sometimes complete morons. Look at the current state of politics, I guess. But criticize them for that, not for wanting a nice color on their phone.
It comes down to convincing people.
Like, I bought my iPhone 15 Pro Max in titanium blue because I like the blue. I would have bought the 15 Pro Max either way. I would have bought it in natural titanium or in space black. But I did buy the color that I liked most.
The next generation.
I'm sorry, my stream is... I'm not even sure if it's losing frames or if it's just like an internet issue at the end. Hopefully it's all good for you. Let me know, guys. Is the stream stable for you?
is the greatest one they've ever made. I believe Steve
I
Jobs.
mean, yes, but the latest iPhone is the greatest. It's the phone with the best battery life, the largest display they ever had, the best camera they ever had, the fastest chip they ever had, the loudest speakers they ever had, the highest quality microphones they ever had. It's the phone that from this day until its last day will get the most support of for software updates or like yeah, of course it's the best iPhone. That does not mean that you need to buy each and every one for being the best, but if you like bought your phone in 2020, as I said, right, and you're now looking into upgrading, let's imagine Apple had only upgraded every 2.5 years, right now, so you would have the iPhone 15 Pro Max basically available for you because that well. No, let's say Apple upgraded the phone every 2 years, right? So then you would have the 15 Pro Max available. So what do you do then, right? Would be my question. Because now you would have to you would be effectively forced to buy a phone that is 1 year old with features that yes might not have seen huge upgrades, but you could be getting 5 to 10% more battery life, 5 to 10% more louder speakers, better cameras, right? Small things, but all those things that could keep you happier, right? Could make you get through a full day of usage even better. Better thermals, right? If you're somebody who have heard of, like, for example, the throttling issues or the display dimming issues of the iPhone 15 Pro, why wouldn't you want to have the 16 Pro available to solve most of that for you?
Saw this coming, and he could see what happens when a company achieves such
Steve Jobs did not see that coming, like in the future. Steve Jobs saw it happening to Apple when John Scully took over, and to the likes of IBM back in the day. This is why your title of Apple has become IBM is a little bit misleading, because obviously we are talking about what has happened to IBM in the 80s rather than what is happening to IBM right now.
incredible victory year after year. It's not sustainable. It doesn't last forever. No matter how much we may love these brands, they all come to the same fate of monopoly. And when that day comes...
That's not the end fate at all of all those companies. Do you think that every company is destined to die after becoming the biggest company in its respective field? No, companies die because they might just lose whatever edge allowed them to sell you products. The word monopoly here is absolutely meaningless and misapplied. I'm sorry.
It no longer matters how great your product can be. All that matters is how well you are at selling it. And when the marketing people...
And by the way, this is one thing that I find so insulting, the way he shows that, right? He's basically talking about Apple's like seasonal promotions like Valentine's Day, right? And he does it while showing that, look, the Mac lineup just launched, like the Mac Mini, the fast M4 chip. It fixed a lot of issues that people saw with the pricing by giving more RAM. It gave more ports to the entry-level M4 MacBook Pro. It gave Thunderbolt 5 to the M4 Pro and M4 Max MacBook Pro, right? The iPhone. For years, people have complained that the regular iPhone felt kind of boring next to the Pro. Guess what? Apple made it much more interesting. And Drew himself said that the regular iPhone 16 is probably the best iPhone. The iPad, introducing tandem OLED on the M4 iPad Pro, giving it like incredible gains in efficiency, visual performance, and of course raw performance by combining the power of the M4 chip with the super fast responsiveness of the world's most advanced OLED panel. The Apple Watch Series 10 just got a redesign. Not a huge one, but still bigger screen, nicer. Yes, Apple Watch Ultra 2 did not get big changes. In fact, it just got the black color version. But that's because there is no real competition to the Apple Watch Ultra 2. So in that regard, yes, Apple arguably just focused on marketing a new color, But the problem here is that the competition is not forcing Apple's hand. Apple Vision Pro, a new market for Apple, a product that just turned exactly 1 year old, right? That needed to have designed like the actual hardware, all the cameras, the sensors, and on top of that needed an operating system like Vision OS with a dedicated user interface. AirPods just got AirPods 4 with nice design, high quality sound, and even integrating features like ANC for an open design. So for people who might not feel comfortable with basically like closing off their ears, now you get a feature you previously didn't have access to. And AirPods Pro 2 at the same time got, for some people, game-changing hearing health functionality. AirTags, again, it's a small thing, will be updated this year. It's an accessories that nobody forced Apple to make. They didn't make it because they were afraid of losing some monopoly status or whatever. Apple TV 4K, again, nobody forces Apple to make it, but sometimes as a hobby, they just put out the world's fastest, smoothest smart TV experience there is. HomePods, similar thing, to amazing sound quality on the big HomePod, amazing ease of use with the little HomePod, and relatively good value for the price. Nobody forces Apple to make all of that shit, but they still do.
And the salespeople start running the company, the innovations and the advancements.
And when it comes to those seasonal things, they date back to the Steve Jobs era. It's not something that Steve was against. Like, are you crazy? Do you think that Steve did not do promotions for Christmas, Mother's Day, Valentine's Day? Those are not big, like, buy our products because we have a random new color to add, which, yeah, sometimes Apple does. Like, for example, the green iPhone 13, right, that was introduced around the spring time. Sure, but, like, Apple was never immune to any of that.
Product itself all start to fall apart. So in the words of
what is falling apart? I still don't understand. Like, you still have not provided a single point. The customer satisfaction isn't down. The rate of marketing has not increased. The amount of bad features has not increased. Like,
Bane from The Dark Knight Rises, peace has cost you your strength. Victory has defeated you.
I mean, Bane lost in the end, and it's also a stupid thing to say. It's the same bullshit as, you know, like, hard times make hard men make peaceful soft times, and peaceful soft times make hard times. Peaceful soft times make soft men, and those soft men make hard times because they basically screw it up, right? Sure. Yes, you can argue here about like the word soft and how it's very toxically masculine of a perspective on the world, but basically the idea is competence and love for what you do got you to where you are now, and then complicity basically pushed you down, right? That's a more like appropriate way of saying the way Steve said it. Basically, whether it's your own complicity or literally by getting replaced by somebody who does not have your love and dedication to the industry you're in. But like, again, none of that has, like, Apple doesn't even have new leadership at this point.
When they start getting bigger, they want to replicate their initial success. And a lot of them think, well, somehow there's some magic in the process of how that success was created. So they start to try to institutionalize process across the company. And before very long, people get very confused that the process is the content. And that's ultimately the downfall of IBM.
Yeah, literally none of that has happened with Apple. The process of what
the best process people in the world. They just forgot about the content.
That process was something that this is not. Oh my God, Drew does not understand what Steve means with process. He does not mean the way you build the product. He means the exact opposite. The way you build the product. Do you remember when Apple introduced the aluminum unibody enclosure for the Mac and had like Johnny Ive explain it in a dedicated video? Oh my God, Drew does not understand what he is saying at all. The process is about meetings. It's about marketing discussions. It's about prioritizing shit like colors. Like he's basically saying, if all you do to improve your product is pointless talking points, you end up not having even something in the end to have talking points about. Actually being innovative and creating stuff like curved motherboards for the Apple Vision Pro, being innovative with metallurgical designs for the Apple Watch, for the iPhone, pays off. It's not just something to sell people on a more expensive material on, even though you can do that, as we have seen with like the gold and the stainless steel and the titanium Apple Watches. But then you also end up using whatever you have learned there, and you create a better titanium Apple Watch, like the Apple Watch Ultra. Like it's such stupid things. Like, oh my god, like Drew did not understand what Steve was saying here at all.
And that's what happened a little bit at Apple too.
The process is the discussion behind the it's when you're basically saying, oh, how do we sell our products, and oh my god, and you basically make up marketing slogans in the background, right? You have constant meetings about shit like that, and you neglect the actual product. That's the process he's talking about. This is the actual process that Steve celebrated. You moronic dumb donkey.
As we're now seeing this inevitable stagnation of the tech community plateauing, it only leads me to believe that innovation hasn't stopped. It's really just moved elsewhere. In the end, I'm ultimately just...
Where is my problem? Drew has an entire channel dedicated to basically Tesla, but broadly EVs. What has Tesla recently done to like warrant that love from him? They did not deliver FSD. They talked about it for way longer than Apple did Apple Intelligence. They pushed it for way further away. They priced it at exorbitant like FOMO prices, trying to price it higher and higher, so people eventually felt the need to pull the to finally click the button. So, oh my god, if I don't get it now for 10K, it will be 14K in a month for shit like that, right? Like I question your taste, brother. If you think that like don't get me wrong, there's absolutely innovation happening. For example, Nvidia, for all its problems with how little RAM they might give you, like look at the latest like a ray traced mega geometry video from Digital Foundry that just came out. Nvidia is super innovative. Ray tracing, like very nice hardware accelerated ray tracing, being the first to mesh shading and things like that, being the first to well, in the PC space, to proper AI accelerators, combining that all with stuff like ray reconstructions with DLSS 3.5. DLSS is a feature overall, and now frame gen, multi-frame gen, some of those features, but then get marketed to death because you need to reach consumers, and sometimes that marketing will even be flat out misleading. But that's not a sign of the company stopping to innovate. It's sometimes the sign that the marketing department just overdid itself a little bit.
Grateful that I did not brand this channel purely around Apple. Thankfully, we called it Tailosive Tech in the end, which means now might be the time to start pivoting. And I think there's a lot of fascinating developments going on out there in the tech industry, but I encourage viewers as we move into the next phase of this channel to keep an open mind and try to remember what technology really makes a difference and really makes an impact in our day-to-day lives and what things we can look forward to in the future. I'm not going to stop talking about Apple.
Yeah,
you don't have to all freak out, but the frequency of uploads about Apple might not be as much as it used to, and I only think this is a natural progression if I'm going to keep this channel focused on honesty and integrity, rather than hype up every announcement as if it's the next big thing whenever Apple does something. I'd rather move...
That was never your task, bro. You should have always been holding Apple accountable. That was always, like, Apple always had LOL upgrade years, or Apple always had, like, 1 year where they might not have given you a new iPad or something like that, like 2023, for example. Like, where do you come from? Where this was never your task. You misunderstood your task as a YouTuber if you ever thought like you should be hyping up every product. Yeah, you grew more mature and it might be more difficult for yourself to get as excited as you were in the past. But I just find it a little bit insulting that you ever thought that like your audience expected from you like boundless enthusiasm towards Apple.
Move towards what I think is the next Apple, in a sense, and what technology will look like in our worlds and which technology is on the horizon. And in the not too distant future, I want to highlight why you should care about any of this stuff in the first place, or at least why I am fascinated in the tech field as a whole and why I'm not stopping, why this channel is not dying, and that change in the end is really the only constant. And because us human beings are...
Okay, yeah, that's enough. So keep out checking his newer content. Let me know how it develops from here. I'm pretty disappointed with the trajectory he has taken on. I'm happy he is doing something that might be more fun to him. I hope that encourages him to have high quality again. I say while my stream is like stuttering like crazy. But yeah, I do believe that's about it. I think I've said more than enough. I don't want to be rude. I did got rude a little bit when I thought that he was really not even paying attention to the things he was commenting on. So let's move away from that and let's just see what else we can cover. Let's actually start with some great content.
Hey guys, this is
from Dame Tech, a great YouTube channel. Subscribe to him. I'm not subscribed here, but I am subscribed on my own account. And he is testing Withering Waves and Genshin Impact between the iPhone 16 Pro Max, the Galaxy S25 Ultra, and I believe the Red Magic latest gaming phone. And I just want to show you the summary results. I don't want to like react obviously to his gameplay. Please check out the entire video where he will comment on whether a product dims in the process or something like that. To me, the most important thing are the charts. Always keep in mind that settings are sometimes hard to 100% match between different operating systems. Keep that in mind. So here we have a test with Withering Waves. That's the latest version of the game. The iPhone ran at 60 FPS, dropped in its 1% lows to 51 FPS. This is a pretty nice VRR window, so your screen should feel pretty much exactly as smooth, whether it's displaying 60 FPS or 51 FPS. So the iPhone and the Galaxy ran at very, very comparable frame rates here. The iPhone ran at higher resolutions. It's not a massive difference, but the iPhone also ended up noticeably cooler. And the reason for that is that the iPhone used a lot less energy, 5.4 watts versus 7.2 watts. You can make your calculations what that would mean for the overall battery life, given the 4,600 milliampere hours here versus the 5,000 milliampere hours here. And then the Red Magic 10 Pro, now this is in its power mode as far as I understand. That one achieved higher frame rates and definitely managed to clock 60 FPS more regularly. So its 1 FPS lows are actually the highest here. However, it does not run at very high resolutions in comparison to the iPhone. And you achieve that great performance with very, very high power consumption. In fact, even if you offset for the 7,000 milliampere hour battery that you find in the Red Magic, you'll find that the iPhone would end up effectively with longer battery life because it just consumes so much less power. However, of course, if you are focused on a consistent gaming experience, this is the best product here, and it's the coolest because of active cooling inside. Angelica joining the chat, thank you very much, saying my streams are very good for the soul. I very, very much appreciate that compliment. I, again, apologize for my consistent frame losses and shit like that. No idea what's happening. Something is just killing my upload today, so I hope it still works out for you. I really cannot fix it. YouTube will fix it in post. It will basically realign all those stuttery frames, but for now I hope at least the audio is working all right for you. By the way, whenever I go to the home screen, I actually have OBS open here, but OBS is just hidden from your view. So let's go back. So very good efficiency results for the iPhone. You can see that Snapdragon 8 Elite obviously can match the iPhone's performance level, but it does not do so at the same power consumption, right? And looking at Genshin Impact, you'll find the following.
Wuthering Waves.
Please.
Last but not least.
So here it's actually pretty interesting too, because we are looking at a very unique outcome. Genshin Impact does not support 120 FPS on these other Android devices. Thankfully, you do have actually a lot of data across the board, even for something like the 16 Plus and its regular A18 chip rather than its Pro chip, running at 4.5 watts. Guys, let me just quickly switch to OBS. And can I change my output to what can I change? It's running in software. Can I change it? No, I cannot change resolution or frame rate in the meantime. That's such a freaking shame. Please work, OBS. Especially since we now have more people joining. I just want to give everyone a nice and enjoyable user experience. Let me quickly have a look. Okay, so the stream did at least not fully crash, and my upload seems to be pretty okay right now. Guys, let me know, is the stream stable? Is it just on, like, what is, I have no idea what's happening. Is it because, is my PlayStation uploading something? Is something killing my upload at home? Because I would at least understand download issues, but I have upload issues, which is so weird to see. So here the iPhone does deliver you up to 120 FPS, but obviously it cannot reach that. So it's limited to 95 FPS. With a 1% low of 70 FPS, doesn't even get too hot. And now compare that to the Galaxy S25 Ultra, which delivers pretty similar results to what it did at Wuthering Waves, around with lower power consumption, though Genshin Impact is less demanding. But look, it got hotter than the iPhone, ran at about the same power consumption, like maybe 10% difference at most. But it did so while running at significantly lower frame rates and even a slightly lower resolution. So this difference is just crazy to me. And then when you look at the Red Magic, you'll find it once again limited at 60. It got to its 60 FPS limit quite well. And I'm sure if you allow it to run at 9 watts and unlock it to 120 FPS, I wouldn't be surprised if it did a nice job matching the iPhone's performance. But yeah, it is a gaming phone with a lot higher power consumption, even here, right? Low resolution, lower frame rate, way lower frame rate than the iPhone, still actually comes with higher power consumption. And really cool thing for the regular iPhone 16 Plus, it is a 60 hertz screen anyway, so it's 60 FPS limited, actually achieves it more nicely than the S25 Ultra, does so at lower temps and at a higher resolution and at way lower power consumption. So this is actually really, really cool, at least in my opinion. Yeah, let me quickly look. So OBS still sucks. My upload still sucks. I might have to start streaming at night because whatever is happening in my home seemingly is really, really bad for the upload. I'll just get myself an Ethernet adapter and hope that it's just a Wi-Fi issues rather than like a network or full-on router issue. Oh, damn. So that's it for the S25 Ultra performance numbers, the newest ones. I'll keep on talking about S25 results as we keep on exploring it. There is more stuff to cover. However, I will probably talk more about this actually at some other time because I am getting annoyed by all the stutters. I apologize. Hopefully to those people watching this afterwards, you will still have a nice viewer experience because YouTube will fix that in post. But I do not want to waste your time to those watching live right now with a stuttery mess. So we will keep on covering these issues. It might take me actually a week before I'm back, or I'll have like a stream when I'm visiting family this weekend, but I will let you know when I'm going live next. Thank you guys so much for everything. Thank you for joining today. I know it's a slightly more drama focused topic. Relay, welcome to the chat, bro. I apologize. I'm moving out because my OBS is just like killing all my frames, and it's really going on my nerves to stream while I see the stuttery mess on my iPad. So I hope you can forgive me for walking out on you right as you're joining. But thank you to anyone who joined, whether it's now or before that. Please check out the video afterwards. Please comment afterwards too. That helps a lot with the algorithm. And as always, let me know what you would like to see me cover next. I'll keep this video on. Usually I delete videos where like there's a lot of like me complaining about stutter, but since I won't be able to do much covering in the meantime, I will let this be here, and you guys hopefully engage with me in the comments, on Twitter, all that fun stuff. So again, I'll see you soon. Let me know what you would like to see me cover next. This is Mark Tech tuning out.